Hey guys, welcome back to the Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled people story. After everything that happened, I feel like I need to share it. Maybe it'll help someone else who's dealing with an insane HOA. Or maybe people just need to know how crazy these power-hungry board members can get. This whole mess started about 3 years ago when I inherited my grandfather's old cabin. The place had been sitting empty for almost a decade after he passed, and honestly, it was in rough shape. We're talking about a 1960s ski lodge up in the mountains, built by my grandfather's own hands when the area was basically wilderness. The roof was leaking, the foundation needed work, and the interior looked like something out of a horror movie. But it had good bones, and more importantly, it had history. My grandfather built that lodge as a weekend retreat back when you could buy mountain property for practically nothing. He was a carpenter by trade and spent 3 summers putting together what he called his masterpiece. 2 stories of solid timber construction with a stone fireplace that could heat the whole place, cedar siding that had weathered to this beautiful gray color, and windows positioned perfectly to catch the morning sun over the valley. The property itself was 5 acres of prime mountain real estate, with the lodge sitting on a small rise that gave you an incredible view of the slopes. When I inherited it, I was working as an engineer and had been saving up for years to buy my own place. Instead of buying something new, I decided to honor my grandfather's memory and restore his lodge to its original glory. I took a leave of absence from work and threw everything I had into the project. Those 3 years were some of the hardest and most rewarding of my life. I learned plumbing, electrical work, roofing, and about a dozen other trades just to bring the place back to life. I replaced every piece of rotted wood, updated all the systems to current codes, and even added a few modern touches like radiant floor heating and better insulation. But I kept the original character intact. The cedar siding got properly sealed and maintained, the stone fireplace was restored to working order, and I even found the original blueprints in my grandfather's papers to make sure I was staying true to his vision. The problem started about 2 years into my renovation when I noticed construction activity in the valley below my property. What had been empty forest was suddenly being cleared for development. Within 6 months, a whole neighborhood of massive houses started going up. These weren't modest mountain homes either. We're talking about 5,000 square foot McMansions, all painted in the same boring beige colors with identical landscaping and 3-car garages. At first, I didn't think much of it. Development happens, and I figured having neighbors might not be terrible. My property line was well defined and far enough away that I wouldn't be bothered by the construction noise for long. Plus, my lodge predated everything down there by about 50 years, so I had established rights that couldn't be challenged. That optimism lasted until the first HOA representative showed up at my construction site. I was up on the roof replacing some shingles when this woman in a BMW pulled into my driveway. She got out wearing business attire that was completely inappropriate for a mountain construction site and started yelling up at me about permits and community standards. I climbed down to see what her problem was, and she introduced herself as the president of something called Alpine Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. She explained that my property was now surrounded by their development and that I needed to bring my renovation into compliance with their community guidelines. When I told her that I wasn't part of her HOA and that my property had been there long before her neighborhood existed, she got this smug look on her face and told me that property ownership in the area was more complicated than I understood. I should have paid more attention to that conversation, but I was focused on getting my roof finished before the next snow season. I figured she was just another busybody HOA president trying to extend her authority beyond where it belonged. I'd dealt with difficult people before, and I wasn't about to let some stranger tell me how to restore my own family property. Over the next several months, as I got closer to finishing the renovation, the visits from HOA representatives became more frequent and more aggressive. They complained about my cedar siding not matching their beige color scheme. They said my stone chimney was too tall and blocked their view of the mountain. They even tried to tell me that my gravel driveway needed to be paved with the same stamped concrete as the rest of their development. Every time I explained the same thing. My property wasn't part of their HOA. I had a deed that was decades older than their development. Their community guidelines had no legal authority over my land, but they kept coming back with new complaints and increasingly official-looking paperwork. The worst part was how they talked about my grandfather's lodge. They called it an eyesore, a blight on their community, and completely inappropriate for a modern residential development. One particularly obnoxious board member even suggested that the building should be torn down for everyone's benefit. That's when I stopped being polite and started telling them to get off my property. As my renovation neared completion, I started getting the feeling that they were planning something. The visits stopped, which should have been a relief, but instead it felt ominous. I'd see cars drive slowly past my property and people taking photos. Once, I caught someone from the HOA board walking around my property line with measuring equipment. When I confronted him, he claimed they were just updating their community survey maps. I should have seen it coming, but I was so focused on finally moving into my dream home that I didn't pay enough attention to their scheming. The renovation was finally complete in early December, right in time for ski season. I had spent 3 years of my life and most of my savings transforming my grandfather's derelict cabin into something that would have made him proud. The cedar siding gleamed with fresh stain, the stone fireplace drew perfectly, and every system in the house worked flawlessly. I had taken photos throughout the restoration process, and the before and after shots looked like they belonged in a home renovation magazine. I scheduled my move for a Saturday morning in mid-December. The weather was perfect, with fresh snow on the ground and bright sunshine that made the mountains look like a postcard. I had hired a moving company, and my plan was to spend my first night in the lodge sitting by the fire and enjoying the view I'd been working toward for 3 years. I drove up early that morning to meet the moving truck, carrying a framed photo of my grandfather standing in front of the original lodge. It seemed fitting that his picture would be the first thing I brought into the restored building. The moving truck was already waiting in the driveway when I arrived, and I felt this incredible sense of accomplishment as I walked toward the front door with my grandfather's photo in hand. That feeling lasted about 30 seconds. Just as I was putting my key in the lock, I heard sirens coming up the mountain road. Within minutes, a sheriff's cruiser came tearing into my driveway with lights flashing, followed by 2 civilian vehicles. My heart started pounding because emergency vehicles on a mountain road usually meant someone was hurt or there was some kind of disaster happening. But when the sheriff got out of his car, he wasn't alone. The HOA president climbed out of one of the other cars, along with another board member I recognized from their previous visits. They were both wearing business suits and carrying folders full of paperwork, which seemed like strange attire for whatever emergency had brought the sheriff to my property. The sheriff was a middle-aged guy who looked uncomfortable with the situation. He approached me slowly, keeping his hand near his radio, and asked if I was the person who had been illegally occupying this structure. I was so confused that I couldn't even answer coherently at first. Illegally occupying? This was my house. I had the deed, permits for all the renovation work, and had been paying property taxes for years. That's when the HOA president stepped forward with her folder and started explaining the situation to both me and the sheriff. According to her, my grandfather's lodge was actually community property that belonged to the Alpine Ridge Estates HOA. She claimed that when the development was built, my property had been incorporated into their community charter as the designated clubhouse location. She said I had been renovating their community building without permission and was now attempting to illegally move into what was essentially the neighborhood's shared social center. I tried to interrupt and explain that this was completely insane, but the sheriff held up his hand and asked to see my documentation. The problem was that all my property paperwork was packed away in boxes somewhere in the moving truck. The HOA president, meanwhile, had a folder full of official-looking documents that seemed to support her version of events. She showed the sheriff a community charter that listed my exact address as the designated clubhouse property for Alpine Ridge Estates. She had architectural drawings that showed my lodge being converted into a community center. She even had correspondence from the county planning department about the clubhouse designation. The sheriff studied the paperwork for what felt like forever while I stood there in complete shock. Everything the HOA president was showing him was fake, but it was very convincing fake documentation. The letterhead looked official, the signatures looked real, and she presented everything with the confidence of someone who was absolutely certain of their legal ground. When I finally found my voice and started explaining that I had owned this property for years, the HOA president interrupted with another folder of paperwork. This one contained a list of code violations and community standards infractions that she claimed I had committed during my renovation. She said I had used unauthorized cedar siding, built a chimney that exceeded height limitations, and failed to pay the required new member initiation fee of $50,000. The $50,000 fee was the detail that made me realize just how far they were willing to go with this scam. They weren't just trying to harass me into changing my siding color or trimming my chimney. They were trying to steal my property outright. I demanded that the sheriff look at my deed, which was in a fireproof safe inside the lodge. But when I tried to unlock the front door, the HOA president objected loudly, claiming that I was attempting to break into community property. The sheriff was clearly overwhelmed by the competing claims and the volume of paperwork being waved around. What happened next still makes my blood boil when I think about it. The sheriff decided that since there was a dispute over property ownership, the safest course of action was to maintain the status quo until a judge could sort everything out. That meant I couldn't move into my own house. The sheriff explained that he wasn't arresting anyone or making a determination about who was right, but that I needed to halt my moving plans until the ownership question could be resolved in court. He said this was a civil matter and that forcing my way into a disputed property could result in criminal trespass charges. I watched in complete disbelief as the moving truck driver who had been paid to deliver my belongings to my new home had to turn around and take everything back to storage. The cost of the failed move, including paying the moving crew for a wasted day, was over $2,000 that I didn't really have after spending everything on the renovation. The HOA president was practically glowing with satisfaction as she watched the moving truck disappear down the mountain. She told me that once I accepted reality and paid the appropriate fees to join their community, we could work out a reasonable arrangement for me to rent back one of the bedrooms in what had been my own house. The audacity was breathtaking. After everyone left, I sat in my car in the driveway of my own house, still holding my grandfather's photo, trying to process what had just happened. 3 years of work, all my savings, and my dream of finally living in my family's lodge had been destroyed by a bunch of HOA criminals with fake paperwork and a sheriff who was too confused to know better. But the shock didn't last long. As I sat there, the anger started building. These people had just tried to steal my property using fraudulent documents and law enforcement as their accomplices. They had cost me thousands of dollars and prevented me from moving into my own home. And from the confident way the HOA president had handled the whole situation, it was clear this wasn't their first time pulling something like this. I drove straight home and started making phone calls. The first call was to a real estate attorney who specialized in property disputes. The second call was to the county clerk's office to request copies of all the documentation related to my property and the surrounding development. The third call was to a private investigator I'd worked with years earlier on a construction fraud case. What we uncovered over the next 2 weeks was worse than I had imagined. The Alpine Ridge Estates HOA hadn't just tried to steal my property. They had actually sold memberships to dozens of families with the promise that the community would include a historic clubhouse that they didn't own. My grandfather's lodge was featured prominently in their marketing materials and sales presentations, always described as a charming centerpiece that would host community events and add character to their development. The HOA had collected initiation fees and monthly dues from every family in the development, partly based on amenities that included access to my property. When families asked about when the clubhouse would be available for events, the board members assured them that it was just a matter of working out some minor paperwork issues with the previous owner. My attorney explained that what they had done was essentially fraud on multiple levels. They had misrepresented property ownership to law enforcement, created false documents to support their claims, and sold memberships under false pretenses to unsuspecting families. The fake paperwork they had shown the sheriff was sophisticated enough that it had fooled a law enforcement officer, which elevated their actions from simple harassment to something that could result in serious criminal charges. While we were gathering evidence, the HOA didn't sit still. They escalated their harassment campaign in ways that showed just how desperate they were becoming. They put up official-looking signs around my property that said "No trespassing, HOA property," and "Future site of Alpine Ridge Community Center." They contacted the utility companies and tried to have my power and water shut off, claiming that services to the property needed to be transferred to the HOA for community use. The worst incident happened when I drove up to check on the property and found that someone had changed the locks on my house. When I called the sheriff's department to report a break-in, the same HOA president showed up and claimed that they had secured the community property to prevent vandalism. She actually had the nerve to suggest that I was the one who was trespassing by trying to enter their clubhouse. That's when I decided to stop playing defense and go on the attack. My attorney filed an emergency motion for a temporary restraining order against the HOA, demanding that they stop their harassment and restore my access to my own property. We also filed a formal complaint with the sheriff's department about the HOA's fraudulent use of law enforcement to carry out their property theft scheme. The emergency hearing was scheduled for the following Monday, which gave us the weekend to prepare our case. My attorney was confident that once a judge reviewed the actual property records and saw through the HOA's fake documentation, we would not only get my property back, but also be able to pursue serious damages for their harassment campaign. I spent that weekend gathering every piece of documentation I had about my grandfather's lodge. Original blueprints, property tax records going back 40 years, photos from the renovation, permits for all the work I had done, and a detailed timeline of every interaction I'd had with the HOA. I also prepared a financial accounting of all the costs their actions had caused, from the failed moving day to the attorney fees to the lost rent I was paying for temporary housing. Walking into that courtroom on Monday morning, I felt like I was carrying the weight of my grandfather's legacy. This wasn't just about my house anymore. It was about protecting the memory of a man who had built something with his own hands and passed it down to his family. The HOA was trying to steal not just my property, but my heritage. The hearing was scheduled in front of a judge who had a reputation for not tolerating nonsense in his courtroom. The HOA president arrived with 2 other board members and a lawyer who looked like he specialized in intimidating people rather than understanding property law. They were all dressed in expensive business attire and carried multiple briefcases, clearly trying to project an image of authority and legitimacy. When the judge called our case, the HOA's attorney immediately launched into a presentation about community property rights and the importance of maintaining neighborhood standards. He argued that my grandfather's lodge had been legally incorporated into their community development and that my renovation work had been done without proper authorization from the property's true owners. The judge listened patiently for about 5 minutes before interrupting with a question that cut straight to the heart of their argument. He asked to see the legal documentation that transferred ownership of my property from my grandfather's estate to the Alpine Ridge Estates HOA. The attorney shuffled through his papers for a moment before admitting that he didn't have that specific document with him. That's when my attorney stood up and presented the real property records. The deed to my grandfather's lodge was dated 1962, more than 40 years before the Alpine Ridge development was even planned. The property tax records showed continuous ownership by my family with no gaps or transfers to any HOA. The county planning documents showed that my property had never been included in any community development plan. The judge asked the HOA's attorney to explain how his clients had acquired ownership of a property that predated their organization by decades and had never been legally transferred to them. The attorney started stammering about community incorporation procedures and retroactive property designations, but it was clear he was making it up as he went along. Then my attorney presented the evidence of the HOA's fraudulent documentation scheme. We had copies of the fake community charter they had shown the sheriff, alongside the real county records that proved no such charter had ever been filed. We had their marketing materials that advertised my property as a community amenity, despite never having legal rights to it. We even had recorded statements from families in the development who confirmed that access to the historic clubhouse had been a major selling point for their home purchases. The judge's expression grew darker as he reviewed each piece of evidence. When he asked the HOA president to explain why she had presented false documents to law enforcement, she tried to claim that there had been a misunderstanding about property boundaries and community rights. She insisted that they had acted in good faith based on their understanding of the development agreements. That explanation fell apart when my attorney presented the timeline of their harassment campaign. The judge reviewed the evidence of the fake no trespassing signs, the attempts to shut off utilities, and the unauthorized lock changes, all of which had happened after they knew their property claims had been challenged. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate campaign of harassment designed to force me off my own land. The sheriff who had originally responded to their fake emergency call was present as a witness. When he was asked to describe what the HOA representatives had told him that day, he admitted that they had made the situation sound like an urgent criminal matter rather than a civil dispute. They had told him that a violent squatter had taken over community property and was refusing to leave. They had specifically avoided mentioning that there was any legitimate dispute over property ownership. The judge asked the sheriff if he would have responded the same way if he had known the full situation. The sheriff said absolutely not. If he had understood that this was a property ownership dispute between parties with competing legal claims, he would have told them to resolve it in civil court rather than using emergency law enforcement resources. When the HOA president tried to interrupt and clarify their position, the judge cut her off with a statement that I'll never forget. He told her that what she was calling community bylaws were nothing more than club rules with no legal authority over property they didn't own. He said they had about as much power to control my deed as a crayon drawing had to override state law. The judge's ruling was swift and comprehensive. He granted an immediate restraining order that prohibited any member of the Alpine Ridge Estates HOA board from coming within 100 feet of my property line. He ordered them to immediately remove all signage from my land and to restore my access to my own house. He also ordered them to pay all of my moving costs, legal fees, and additional expenses that had resulted from their harassment campaign. But the judge wasn't finished. He said that the HOA's use of fraudulent documents and false statements to law enforcement was a serious matter that warranted further investigation. He was referring the case to the district attorney's office for potential criminal charges related to filing false police reports and fraud. The financial penalties were substantial. In addition to covering all of my direct costs, the judge awarded punitive damages for emotional distress and harassment. The total amount was more than $70,000, which was going to devastate the HOA's reserve fund and result in a special assessment for every family in the development. As we left the courtroom, the HOA president tried one last attempt at negotiation. She approached my attorney and suggested that we could work out a reduced settlement if I agreed not to pursue the criminal charges. My attorney told her that the criminal investigation was out of our hands now, since the judge had already made the referral to the district attorney. The aftermath of the court ruling was swift and satisfying. That same afternoon, I had a locksmith meet me at my property to change the locks back and restore my access. The HOA's fake signs were gone by the next morning, apparently removed by the same board members who had put them up. The sheriff who had originally been tricked into blocking my move-in stopped by later that week to personally apologize. He said he felt terrible about being used as a tool in their property theft scheme and offered to help me move my first piece of furniture back into the house as a gesture of goodwill. We ended up carrying my grandfather's antique dining table up to the front door together, and he stayed for coffee while I explained the full history of the property. The financial impact on the Alpine Ridge Estates HOA was catastrophic. The $70,000 judgment was more than their entire annual budget, and they had to levy a special assessment on every property owner in the development to cover the costs. The assessment averaged about $3,000 per household, which did not make the board members popular with their neighbors. Within a month of the court ruling, the HOA president and 2 other board members had been voted out by angry residents who were tired of paying for their leadership's legal disasters. The new board's first official act was to send me a written apology for the harassment I had endured and an assurance that there would be no further interference with my property rights. The district attorney's investigation resulted in criminal charges against 3 members of the original HOA board. The charges included filing false police reports, fraud, and conspiracy to commit theft. The HOA president ended up pleading guilty to reduced charges and paying substantial fines, though she avoided jail time. I finally moved into my grandfather's lodge on a snowy Saturday morning in February, almost 3 months after my original planned move-in date. The moving truck arrived without incident this time, and I spent the day arranging furniture and hanging pictures in the house that had cost me 3 years of work and almost my entire savings to restore. That evening, I sat by the stone fireplace with my grandfather's photo on the mantel, watching the snow fall outside the same windows where he used to watch winter storms 50 years earlier. Down in the valley, the lights of the Alpine Ridge development twinkled in the darkness, but they no longer felt threatening. They were just neighbors now, nothing more. The house was everything I had dreamed it would be during those 3 years of renovation. The radiant heating kept every room comfortable. The stone fireplace filled the main floor with warmth and light, and the views of the mountains were spectacular from every window. But the best part was the sense of connection to my grandfather's legacy, and the satisfaction of knowing that I had protected something he built with his own hands. I learned later that several families in the Alpine Ridge development had actually been relieved by the court ruling. They had been told that the community clubhouse would be available for their events and activities, but had grown frustrated by the board's constant delays and excuses. Once they understood that the board had been lying about owning the property, they realized they had been victims of the same fraud scheme that had targeted me. The new HOA board operated very differently from their predecessors. They focused on maintaining common areas and enforcing reasonable community standards rather than trying to expand their authority over neighboring properties. They never contacted me again about my cedar siding, stone chimney, or any other aspect of my house that didn't match their beige aesthetic. Looking back on the whole experience, I think the most important lesson was about the danger of letting small-scale tyrants go unchallenged. The original HOA board started with petty complaints about my renovation choices, but when I didn't submit to their authority, they escalated to outright fraud and theft. If I had given in to their initial demands or tried to compromise with their illegitimate claims, they would have kept pushing until they took everything. The legal system worked exactly as it was supposed to in this case. When presented with clear evidence and honest testimony, the judge had no trouble seeing through the HOA's deception and holding them accountable for their actions. But it required me to fight back with proper documentation and legal representation rather than just hoping the problem would go away. I still live in my grandfather's lodge, and every winter when the snow covers the mountains and I'm sitting by the fire, I remember how close I came to losing it all to a bunch of power-hungry HOA board members who thought they could steal whatever they wanted. The house stands as a testament to my grandfather's craftsmanship and my determination to protect his legacy, no matter who tried to take it away. The Alpine Ridge development is still there in the valley below, with its neat rows of beige houses and perfectly manicured lawns. But my cedar lodge stands on the hill above them, weathered and authentic and completely uncompromised, just as my grandfather intended when he built it with his own hands more than 60 years ago. The next one is a malicious compliance story. This happened a few years ago when I worked at McDonald's. The one I worked in was near a bunch of schools, so most of the staff was high school kids. As summer vacation started, we began having the trouble of an employee getting break and then spending their break eating their meal and conversating with their friends who were still working in the kitchen. It was having a seriously bad effect on productivity, as well as posing quite a few health risks, so our manager finally initiated a rule that if you were on your break, you couldn't leave the break room until your break was over. This went swimmingly until the kids went back to school. We then had a new problem. Short staffing during break cycles meant our ticket times would skyrocket during rushes. Management lifted the rules so that employees on break could clock in early and help out with the rush, however. The district manager didn't like the implications of employees working shortened or no break shifts and forcefully reinstated the rule. They also doubled down by saying that employees who tried to work during their scheduled break would be written up and/or terminated for doing so. QMC. The date was 4/20 a day when nobody wants to be working at any fast food place, much less McDonald's. We had been getting slammed so hard from the open of the store that we called in extra help from other stores, including the regional and district managers. As the break cycle began, the management was pleased with the sub-2-minute ticket times they had managed to maintain. A few breaks through, and we were managing well. Then came my break. As soon as I sat down to eat, someone came into the store and ordered 47 double quarter pounders. This was right after the Fresh initiative where all quarter pounders were made fresh, so this was already a minor panic. Immediately after that order, someone in the drive-thru ordered 75 20-piece nugget meal. The amount of panic in the kitchen was palpable. I was comfortably lounging in a chair browsing my phone and enjoying my meal while the kitchen struggled to keep up with the orders. As ticket times began to soar, the management did exactly as I expected. District manager came into the break room and demanded me to end my break early and help in the kitchen. My response was very simply, "I'm sorry, but according to the rules you made, I can be written up or terminated for completing your request." I then continued browsing my phone, trying to enjoy the last 10 minutes of my break. The regional manager entered the room and said that he would personally terminate me if I didn't do the thing that I wasn't supposed to do. The other employee who was on break with me immediately rose and clocked in despite still having 10 minutes left on her break. She was written up for breaking the rule after the shift was over, so I felt good sitting in my chair and continuing to ignore them. In the aftermath, the people who made the giant orders took what was made after half an hour and left with refunds for the unmade food, nearly $150 each. Customers who were waiting for smaller orders were compensated with gift cards for their patience, yet many walked out without even getting their orders. We paid out nearly $1,500 in gift cards. Because customers were walking out on orders without collecting them, we had nearly $5,000 in food waste that night. All of the closers went home with nearly 2 bundle boxes of burgers, fries, and nuggets. Regional and district manager were moved to a different region. The rule was edited to say that you were able to clock back in early at the manager's discretion in the event of a rush. Because I was the only employee who held his ground against the regional and district managers during the rush, I was rewarded with free meals and drinks until I moved away from my hometown and couldn't eat at that McDonald's anymore. Although when I come to visit friends, I occasionally get rung up a manager discount by the few employees who still remember me. Anyway, thank you for watching.